There's a global economic shift happening right now, quietly, gradually, and almost invisibly. A shift that most Americans are completely unaware of. A shift that could redefine what it means to live, work, invest, and save money in the United States. And it revolves around a single terrifying question. What happens to America if the U.S. dollar loses its position as the world's dominant currency? For 80 years, the dollar has been the backbone of global trade, the anchor of international finance, and the ultimate symbol of American power. Nations trade in dollars, borrow in dollars, save in dollars, and protect themselves with dollars. Every global crisis, every war, every recession, countries run to the dollar for safety. But what if that changes? What if the world begins moving away from the dollar, not slowly, not hypothetically, but deliberately and strategically? Because right now, BRICS, the alliance of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and over a dozen expanding member nations, are actively building a financial system designed to reduce dependence on the US dollar. This movement has a name, De-Dollarization, and whether Americans realize it or not, it's already begun. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This isn't clickbait economics. This is geopolitical reality unfolding at this exact moment. Over the last 24 months, Russia and China have abandoned the dollar for most of their energy trade. India is increasingly settling imports using its own currency rather than USD. Saudi Arabia, the architect of the petrodollar system that sustained American dominance for half a century, is now negotiating oil trade in Chinese yuan and exploring partnership with BRICS. More than 30 countries have formally expressed interest in joining BRICS or participating in a BRICS-based currency system. For the first time since World War II, a credible coalition is challenging the foundation of American economic power, not with tanks, not with missiles, but with currency. And here's the part almost nobody in America understands. If the world no longer needs dollars for trade, demand for the dollar falls. When demand falls, value falls. And if value falls significantly, the American lifestyle, built on cheap borrowing, cheap imports, and unlimited government spending, begins to break. Because the dollar is not just money. It is the engine powering the entire American economy. Let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered how the United States can run massive deficits year after year? How it can borrow trillions, spend trillions more, print money endlessly, and somehow never collapse like other nations do? It's simply, the world pays for it. America prints dollars. Other countries buy them. America consumes. Other countries produce. America spends beyond what it earns. Other countries finance it. Why? Because they need dollars for global trade. They need dollars for reserves. They need dollars for survival. But what happens if they don't? What happens if countries stop holding dollars as reserves? What happens if nations stop settling trade in dollars? What happens if the world no longer needs to buy US debt to facilitate commerce? The answer is brutally simple. The United States loses its financial superpower. The government loses the ability to borrow cheaply. The Federal Reserve loses its ability to print without consequence. Imports become more expensive. Inflation accelerates. Interest rates explode. And the American standard of living, funded by decades of artificial strength, begins to crumble. This is the doomsday scenario economists once called impossible. But BRICS is making it possible. For decades, the US dollar was untouchable. There was no alternative. Europe tried with the euro. China tried with the yuan. Crypto tried with digital assets. But none could compete with the scale, liquidity, and trust of the US financial system. Until now, what BRICS is building is not just another currency. It's something more powerful, an entire financial ecosystem designed to bypass the United States. A payment system independent from SBUEFT. Trade agreements independent from the US banking network. Currency settlement backed by commodities, especially gold. Strategic energy alliances linking oil producers and industrial giants. And the timing is not accidental. America is more vulnerable now than at any point in modern history. $36 trillion in national debt. $100 trillion per year in interest payments. Record inflation still far above target. A military stretched thin by global commitments. Political chaos and polarization unlike anything seen in decades. And a Federal Reserve trapped between inflation and recession with no remaining tools left to stabilize the system. BRICS saw the weakness, and they moved. The real question is not whether BRICS can replace the dollar tomorrow. They can't. Not yet. The real question is whether they can weaken the dollar enough to break the system Americans rely on. Because reserve currency collapse never happens in a single moment. It happens quietly, gradually, then suddenly, just like Britain in the early 1900s, just like Rome before it, just like every empire whose currency was once the center of the world, until it wasn't. That brings us to the critical moment in this story. How real is de-dollarization? Is this a temporary political stunt? Or is this the beginning of the end of American monetary dominance? And more importantly, what does it mean for the future of the US economy, for US power, and for the lives of everyday Americans? To answer that, we need to understand three things: why BRICS is doing this, how they plan to execute it, What happens to the United States if they succeed? And once you see these three pieces clearly, you will understand why the next decade may be the most dangerous and transformative economic period in modern American history. Because if the dollar falls, America falls with it. Let's start with the first question. Why is BRICS trying to destroy the dollar's dominance in the first place? And why now? The answer begins with power, not economic power, geopolitical power. For decades, the United States has used the dollar not just as a currency, but as a weapon, controlling global finance, global banking, and global trade enforcement. When a nation angers Washington, when a country refuses to comply with U.S. foreign policy, or when America wants to cripple an opponent without firing a single bullet, it uses sanctions. And sanctions only work because the world is dependent on the dollar. Freeze bank accounts, cut access to STUEFT, block international trade, shut down currency reserves. One stroke and a nation's entire economy suffocates. Russia saw it in 2022. Iran saw it for decades. Venezuela, Cuba, Afghanistan. Dozens of nations have watched their financial systems collapse, not because their economies failed, but because the United States turned the dollar into a weapon. And here's the part Americans rarely consider. If the United States can freeze a country's dollar reserves, are those reserves truly theirs? If global trade depends entirely on American permission, is the world truly sovereign? BRICS asked that question, and the answer terrified them. When the U.S. seized hundreds of billions of Russian reserves overnight, the world realized something. No country is safe if all global finance is controlled by one nation. That moment, the freezing of Russian dollar assets, was the turning point. It triggered the largest global rethinking of currency strategy since World War II. Because if it could happen to Russia, a nuclear superpower, it could happen to anyone. And so Russia, China, India, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Brazil, South Africa, Egypt, UAE, and dozens more began accelerating a plan they had quietly discussed for years: build a financial system that America cannot control. BRICS isn't just an economic alliance anymore. It's a geopolitical resistance movement. And every nation joining it has the same goal: break free from the dollar before the dollar breaks them. But sanctions are only one part of the story. The second reason BRICS is attacking the dollar is energy. For 50 years, oil, the lifeblood of the world, has been priced and sold almost exclusively in dollars. This system is called the petrodollar, and it's the foundation of American dominance. Oil producers sell oil in dollars. They store profits in dollar reserves. They buy U.S. Treasury bonds. The U.S. gets unlimited cheap financing. America lives beyond its means. This was the genius deal struck in 1974 between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. America would protect the Saudi monarchy militarily. In exchange, Saudi Arabia would force the world to buy oil in USD. That deal is now dissolving. Saudi Arabia has joined BRICS. Saudi Arabia is negotiating oil trade in Chinese yuan. And Saudi Arabia has openly stated it is open to settling energy in multiple currencies. Not just the dollar. This is the financial equivalent of a gunshot, because when oil stops being priced in dollars, countries stop needing trillions of dollars in reserves. And when reserves fall, demand for U.S. treasuries collapses. And when demand collapses, interest rates explode. That means mortgages skyrocket, credit becomes unaffordable, government debt costs become unsustainable, inflation accelerates uncontrollably, and the U.S. economy enters a crisis unlike anything in modern history. The third reason BRICS is pushing de-dollarization is simple economic survival. The U.S. dollar is strong today not because the American economy is healthy, but because the world is forced to use it. But the fundamentals are crumbling. 36 trillion national debt, over 90 trillion total U.S. debt across government, corporations, consumers. A shrinking manufacturing base, record inequality, dependence on imported goods, political paralysis, and a financial system built on endless printing. If any other nation had this profile, the world would consider its currency unstable. The only reason America isn't collapsing is because the world is holding it up. BRICS sees the vulnerability. They see a superpower overstretched, overleveraged, and internally divided. And they see an opportunity history says only comes once per century. The chance to dethrone the global empire without ever firing a shot. This brings us to the most critical part of this story. How exactly does de-dollarization happen? Not in theory, in real mechanical terms. It happens in 4 stages. Stage 1. Trade settlement moves away from dollars. Countries begin using their own currencies or alternatives to buy and sell goods. This has already begun. Russia and China. 90% of energy trade now conducted in yuan. India pays for Russian oil in rupees, dirhams, and yuan. Saudi Arabia openly negotiating yuan-based oil trading. Every trade that bypasses the dollar weakens demand for USD. Stage 2. Reserves shift away from dollar storage. Central banks around the world are dumping U.S. treasuries and buying gold at the fastest pace in modern history. Why gold? Because gold is neutral money. No country controls it. China, Russia, India, Turkey, and even European nations like Poland have been accelerating gold purchases for 5 straight years. Gold is the exit door from dollar dependency. Stage 3. Build alternatives to Western controlled payment systems. The BRICS payment system and China's CEP system are direct competitors to WFT. When global banking can operate without U.S. oversight, sanctions lose power. Once trust exists in a parallel system, nations will switch permanently. Stage 4. Launch a BRICS settlement currency, not a traditional national currency, but a commodity-backed unit, most likely backed by gold, energy, and minerals. Why is that important? Because a commodity-backed instrument could offer something the dollar no longer does: stability. For the first time in decades, the world would have a currency option that is backed by real assets, not controlled by one nation, immune to foreign sanctions, protected from inflationary money printing. Once that exists, large nations won't need to hold dollars at all. And if the world no longer needs dollars, the dollar collapses. Not instantly, not tomorrow, but gradually, then suddenly. Just like every empire before it. Now, the most important question: what does all this mean for the United States and for ordinary Americans? Not theoretically, not academically, but in real life. Because while de-dollarization sounds like a foreign policy debate, its consequences will be felt in every American home, every American business, and every American wallet. This is where the story turns from global strategy to personal impact. And what comes next is the part almost nobody is prepared for. So what does de-dollarization actually mean for ordinary Americans? Let's strip away theory and talk about real, world consequences that directly affect your life, your savings, your job, your home, and your future. Because if the dollar weakens significantly, or collapses as some predict, the impact will be immediate, unavoidable, and brutal. For 80 years, the American economy has been built on one core advantage: the ability to print the world's money. When the U.S. government needs money, it doesn't raise taxes, it doesn't cut spending, it doesn't generate economic output. It prints dollars, and the world absorbs them. That's how America has funded wars, bailouts, stimulus checks, bank rescues, corporate rescues, and endless deficit spending without collapsing. That's how Americans enjoy a lifestyle far above what the country actually earns. That's why the U.S. has been able to consume exponentially more than it produces. But if the world stops buying dollars and stops financing American debt, the bill comes due. And when the bill comes due, the consequences will reshape every aspect of American life. Consequence E1, explosive inflation. If global demand for the dollar falls, the value of the dollar falls. And when the value of the dollar falls, imports get more expensive. America imports almost everything: oil, electronics, medicine, steel, food, clothing, cars, you name it. If the dollar loses reserve status, prices don't rise 5% or 10 cents. They rise 50%, 80%, 200%. Imagine gas at 12 a gallon, bread at 10 a loaf, rent doubling in 12 months. A middle-class salary no longer middle class. That's not speculation. That's what happens when a currency loses global trust. This is what happened in Argentina, in Turkey, in Venezuela, in every nation that lost currency dominance. The U.S. wouldn't become Venezuela overnight, but the trajectory would rhyme. Consequence E2. Interest rates skyrocket right now. America borrows money at artificially low rates because the world desperately wants U.S. debt. But if countries no longer buy U.S. treasuries, the government must offer much higher interest to attract buyers. 10-year treasury yields could jump from 4% to 10-15%. Mortgage rates could jump to 12-18%. Student loans, auto loans, business loans, unaffordable. The housing market collapses. Small businesses die. Retirement plans evaporate. The stock market implodes under credit stress. Consequence E3. Government crisis and social breakdown. When a government can't finance itself cheaply, it has two choices: raise taxes dramatically or cut spending violently. Neither is politically survivable. Social programs collapse. Pensions evaporate. Federal workers are laid off. Military spending shrinks. And a nation already divided becomes unstable. Historically, currency collapse leads to political extremism, protests, riots, and revolution. Not because of ideology, because of hunger. People don't march for slogans. People march when they can't afford food. Consequence E4. The end of the American century. The power of the United States is not its military. It's the dollar. Aircraft carriers project force. The dollar controls the world. Without dollar dominance, U.S. sanctions stop working. U.S. wars become unaffordable. U.S. influence collapses. Alliances weaken. Rivals strengthen. China becomes the world's financial center. Saudi Arabia pivots east. Africa aligns with BRICS, not Washington. South America follows. Europe fractures under energy dependence. The world becomes multipolar, and America becomes just another country. Not the superpower, not the leader, not the empire. But here's the question that matters most: is a U.S. dollar collapse guaranteed? No. Nothing in economics is guaranteed. But is it possible? More possible than at any time in U.S. history. Are the conditions for collapse forming? Yes. Is BRICS accelerating the decline? Absolutely. Will this happen overnight? No. It always looks stable until it suddenly isn't. Just like 1929. Just like 2008. Just like every collapse in history. Gradually. Then suddenly. So what can Americans do? This is not financial advice. This is pattern recognition. Here is what historically protects people when empires decline: a reduced exposure to debt. Debt becomes a weapon when interest explodes. A hold assets that can't be printed: gold, silver, land, businesses, skills. A diversify outside a single currency: multiple baskets survive currency transition. The build cash reserves for opportunity. Collapses create generational buying moments. The protect income streams: be valuable, adaptable, and mobile. A stay informed. Collapses crush the uninformed and enrich the prepared. Currency collapse doesn't destroy wealth. It transfers wealth from those who sleep to those who see. The US dollar has dominated the world for 80 years. Empires historically last around 2 to 50 years. America is at year 247. The timing is not accidental. The pattern is not random. The warning signs are not subtle. The world is shifting. Power is shifting. Money is shifting. And if BRICS succeeds, even partially, America will face the most significant economic transformation in its history. Not in 50 years. Not in 20 years. In this decade. The question is no longer, could the dollar collapse? The question is, will America be ready when it does? Because history has a brutal rule: those who prepare early survive. Those who wait do not. This is not fear. This is not doom. This is the most important financial reality Americans will face in their lifetimes. The world is moving on. BRICS is building the replacement. And the dollar is running out of time. The future is already being written. The only question is, will you watch it happen? Or will you prepare for it?